This is the Smart Poker Study Podcast for players who are always striving to be better today than they were yesterday. Through strategy discussions, Q&As, and Poker Pro interviews, we'll dive deep into everything related to poker tactics, study techniques, and the mental side of the game. All in an effort to improve your skills, maximize your profits, and to make you a lifelong successful player. This podcast is brought to you by SmartPokerStudy.com, and I'm your host, Sky Matsuhashi. Poker people, make sure you listen to episode 21, where I showed you how to get the most out of every poker strategy book you read, and to ensure you put to use the valuable lessons contained within. Hey poker people, it's here, day 22 of my 30-day challenge to release a new podcast every day. We are trucking right along, and I hope you're enjoying the ride. Oh, Breaking Bad report, and just to let you know, of course, there's some spoilers here, so fast forward about 2 minutes or so if you have not watched Breaking Bad yet. If not, just follow along and live vicariously through me here. I finally watched the season 1 final episode, and I frickin' loved it. This whole life that Walt is leading right now of crime, it's kind of exciting him, and it's exciting me just watching him go through it, you know. And Skylar obviously has seen this new side of Walt, and she's getting into it. She doesn't know what's going on, but she kind of likes this new Walt, of course. And what interesting, also, Skylar's sister is obviously a klepto. We saw her steal those shoes back in episode 3 or 4, and I thought maybe she was just doing it because that saleswoman was bitchy to her. But no, she's a kleptomaniac, you know, and her husband Hank is investigating the theft of lab equipment at the school. And they can't get enough Sudafed, so they steal an entire barrel of chemicals. And the way they did it was awesome, trapping that guard in the porta potty, couldn't get out, and just manhandling that 200-pound barrel, whatever it was, out through the gates. You know, it was awesome. And they got that because, you know, they're cooking it in the basement now instead of in the RV, so that's crazy, like doing it on the premises right there. And what else happened? The janitor got arrested, and Walt seemed upset about it, but so far he's not doing anything about it. I mean, maybe, you know, what is there to do? The guy's arrested and he's going to get deported. Walt Jr. got busted for trying to buy alcohol. The guys complete that deal with Tuco, and Walt gets ballsy and asks for money up front, and wow, that was just awesome. Oh my gosh. And speaking of Tuco, he demonstrated how bad of a guy he is. He's not a guy to mess with when he beats the crap out of his own dude, you know? Stuff like that kind of always confuses me. It's like, you have this bad guy, kind of a dictator, a ruthless boss, you know, through violence, or he uses coercion and violence to get what he wants. And the threat of violence, of course, and his men kind of accept that they'll get beat down someday. You know, Tuco pulverized this guy, and the other bigger guy, his partner, you know, one of Tuco's guards, right-hand man, whatever he is, just kind of watched it happen like it's no thing at all. And if that were me, I'd be all like, damn, he did this to my partner. He could do it to me. I'm bouncing. But, you know, I guess these guys are in the situation they're in because they ain't too bright in the first place, and they probably don't have many other prospects. So I guess they kind of accept that their boss can go mental, and they'll wind up in the hospital or, God forbid, in a shallow ditch of their own. Man, that's not for me. I'd have to get out of there, but, you know, I'm not a gangbanger to begin with anyway. But I am super stoked to get on to season 2. I will report back a little bit later when I start watching that one. But okay, on to the pokers here. This is the 4th episode in a 10-episode series, all about Ed Miller's book, The Course. Each of the 10 episodes will cover one of the skills that Ed Miller discusses in the book, and today we'll cover skill number 4, barreling. Barreling is firing bets, and most of the time it's C bets, over multiple streets to get your opponent to lay down their hand. There's one barrel, double barrel, and triple barrel bluffs that we can employ to get them to fold. Okay, for an overview of this episode, kind of like the previous episodes, I'll go through this 4th chapter by hitting each step in my 7-step process to getting the most from poker books. We'll get really deep into analyzing barreling opportunities and the math associated with them. We'll analyze opponents' stats to determine when it's a good time to barrel, and we'll look at some Flopzilla calculations for how often certain ranges are likely to hit the flop. I'll also show you how to filter for barreling opportunities in Poker Tracker 4. Of course, if you haven't already downloaded it, hit today's show notes page at smartpokerstudy.com/pod28 to download your own copy of my 7 Steps to Poker Book Learning PDF to follow along with everything today. Now here it is, today's podcast mission. My mission for today is to teach you how to effectively barrel your opponents off of their weak hands. Alrighty, I'm sure you have the 7 Steps PDF open in front of you or on the computer. So step number 1, of course, is skimming. So as we skim through this chapter, I've got the chapter in my hands, or the book in my hands here. Skill number 4 is barreling. So it looks like we talk a lot about, let's see, he talks about barreling. This is kind of a transition. The first 3 skills that he talked about were all about your hand, and now we're thinking about what our opponent has. Are they weak or strong? Here's a long quote right here from an article he wrote back in 2013 with a lot of some EV math in it and some other good stuff. The next header is just called continuation betting. Nice and simple right here, talking about C bets. The next header is barreling beyond the flop. So maybe making some turn and river barrels here. Betting the turn is the next header. Goes into a lot of things to think about when you're barreling the turn. Next up is, of course, like always, multi-way pots and loose players. That's one thing I love about Ed Miller's book here. He talks about the specifics of whatever skill he's referencing, but then he also makes sure to hit how to play or how to use that skill in multi-way pots and loose games. Oh, within this, he also gives 4 awesome reasons to bet into multi-way action. So that's good to read. I hope you guys pick up this book and read and learn from that. And the final header of the chapter is called Final Thoughts, where he gives a background, also talks about skill number 5 and what learning here goes into skill number 5, the next one, which we'll cover tomorrow, of course. And overall, this chapter is 21 pages long, so there is tons of killer info. Alright, so now that we've skimmed and we have a basic understanding of the chapter, we want to read it productively and effectively. To do this, I've devised 3 questions, and finding the answers to these questions is your goal while reading. So the 3 questions are, the first one, what skills can I learn from this chapter? Well, we're obviously going to learn about how to push people off of hands through effective C betting on the flop and barreling turns and maybe even rivers, and that is some awesome stuff to know. Question number 2 is, why are these skills important or relevant to my game? Well, we all know that aggression is what wins out in poker, but blind aggression is something we want to avoid. I think this chapter will teach us to get aggressive for a purpose and help us find good spots and opponent types to get aggressive against. I know that for myself, when I've got marginal hands, even in position, it's tough to call multiple streets. I feel like I could just be paying off a strong hand and he's going for max value. So using this tendency of my own, but I'm sure my opponents have it, so using this tendency against my opponents will lead to more profits. And the final question, how can I implement these skills in my game? Well, that's why we're reading. That's what we want to find out. How can we implement c-betting and barreling into our game to push opponents off of hands? So let's read and find out how we can do it. Alrighty, so step number 3 is, of course, reading, and that was a killer chapter. It was so much to read, and my margins are full of notes, lots of underlining sentences as well, and there's way too much to unpack here for a podcast episode. But there's one thing that I'd really like to focus on. Ed Miller said, and I quote, "Barreling is not about what you hold or what you could hold. Barreling is about punishing your opponent for having too many junk hands and his choosing to get rid of those extra hands by folding them." And this is like a mindset shift for when it comes to barreling. This changes your perspective from, I was the pre-flop raiser, so I can rep the ace on the flop and barrel him off. And it changes your perspective to something like, he's got a wide, weak range, so he probably didn't hit this flop hard, and I can barrel him off his hand. So you're concerning yourself with just his weak range. You're not even thinking about your own cards anymore. They become sort of irrelevant, and you can often barrel opponents based on their stats in the situation with any 2 cards. You know what I mean? Basically. So this is great. This is a great skill, and let's examine it further. Okay, so step number 4 in the 7 steps is to summarize and analyze. So first for the summary. From the first skill, we learned that we want to target players with wide and weak ranges, and these guys are perfect to barrel against because they don't hit flops strongly at all, and we'll get into that in a little bit. And most players, ourselves included, find it hard to continue to multi-street aggression with weak hands. Remember the idea of avoiding strength and attacking weakness. So we can use this whole idea against our opponents because firing at pots over multiple streets is absolutely a sign of strength. And most opponents are smart enough to get out of the way with marginal hands or ace high, whatever it is. And those that aren't smart enough, well, we don't fire multiple barrels against them. You know, we only bet for value against those kinds of guys. And barreling, and just about everything else is in poker as well, is easier when you're in position. Your opponent checking to you is a great indication of weakness, so barreling has a higher likelihood of success. When you're out of position, you have one less indication that they're weak because they haven't checked to you yet. So when we're starting to implement this whole barreling tactic, try to at least start doing it in position and then learn from that, and then maybe, get into doing it out of position. So for analyzing barreling, there's 4 things I'd like to discuss next, and they are, number 1 is the math of barreling. Number 2 is stats and notes for player exploitation. Number 3 is using Flopzilla to gauge how well ranges hit flops, how strong ranges are. And the 4th thing is filtering in Poker Tracker 4 to do your hand history reviews and to analyze barreling opportunities. So the first thing I had mentioned was the math of barreling. And when it comes to barreling math, we're looking at the break-even point for our bets. That's really what matters. And quick, tell me the break-even formula. Yep. I think you've got it, but just in case, I'll review it fully. The break-even math, which we covered a little bit back in episode 16 when I talked about having a list of poker weaknesses and leaks, that's calculated as the size of your bet divided by the total pot after your bet is thrown in. So a half pot bet into a $100 pot is $50 divided by $150. So it has to work 33% of the time. So you only have to win 1 out of every 3 times to break even. This is one of the milestones, and here are all of the break-even milestones you should memorize when it comes to break-even math. Half pot bets need to work 33% of the time. 3/4 pot bets need to work 43% of the time, and pot size bets needs to work 50% of the time. So now that we know how often certain bet sizes need to work, how do we estimate how often they'll work? And to answer this, we look at our opponent's stats as well as any notes or history that we have with the player. So this leads me to my next question. What are the best stats available that will help us determine how likely our opponent is to fold to our C-bets? Pause it right now, pause the podcast right now, and list the stats off to yourself. And just a hint, I actually count 3 of them. All right, did you pause it and have your answer? The first is fold to C-bet, and this is flop, turn, or river. The second is C-bet, which is the flop, turn, or river. And the last one is VPIP, or voluntarily put money in the pot. So let's start with fold to C-bet. These are probably the most reliable stats for us to look at. From our history with this player, we can see how often they fold to C-bets, and this is a great indication of future decisions. And remember, the bigger sample we have, the better, but this starts to become pretty reliable just after 6 instances or so of facing C-bets. The next stat we want to look at is C-betting the flop, turn, or river. Now, this tells us which street our opponent gets honest on. The lower the C-bet stat on a given street, the more likely they play straightforwardly on that street. So, for example, a flop C-bet of 80% means he C-bets with almost anything, while a flop C-bet of 30% means he only C-bets with a pair or better, so this guy is flop honest. When we understand what street our opponent gets honest on, we'll know how far we have to take our barreling. And the last stat was VPIP, or voluntarily put money in the pot. The bigger this number, the wider and the weaker their range is, so the less likely they are to flop top pair or better, or a good draw, and be able to continue in the hand while out of position. Not only can our HUD stats help us, but previous history and notes we have on opponents should help as well. So make sure you're taking relevant notes that will help you exploit your opponents in the future. I think I need to do a future podcast on note-taking. Yep, let me write that down here so I won't forget. But regarding notes for barreling, if you know the opponent is fit or fold, or if he gets honest on the turn, that is super important. And also, take notes of any showdowns where you've seen crap starting hands, like maybe you saw him come in with a 10-7 offsuit or a Jack-4 suited, something like that. And seeing these crappy starting hands, they help you gauge the range of your opponent as well. Alright, so the third part to analyzing barreling is using Flopzilla for gauging how strong a range hits a flop. So how do we know how likely or unlikely their weak ranges are to flop good? That's where Flopzilla calculations come into play. This kind of analyzing in Flopzilla, learning how well ranges hit flops, is important because knowing how often these wide ranges miss flops gives us the confidence boost we sometimes need to throw out that first bet and then the second barrel and the third barrel if necessary. And you can find screenshots of all I'm about to talk about in the show notes for this page at smartpokerstudy.com/pod28. So The first one I want to talk about is, what if your opponent is calling with a pretty tight 22% cold calling range? And if you look at the 22% cold calling range, this is all pocket pairs, of course, suited aces, ace-9 or better, lots of suited connectors, suited one-gappers, and like offsuit broadways. So if this guy is calling with 22% calling range, he only hits top pair or better and open-end straight draws and pair plus gut shots about 30% of the time. And that means that they whiff, or they just don't flop very good at all 70% of the time. So they'll likely fold to your c-bets and barrels. That's great to know, obviously. So a 22% range only hits, top pair, open and straight draw, pair plus a gut shot 30% of the time, which means they whiff 70%. A 36% cold call range hits 28% of the time. They miss 72% of the time. A 50% cold call range hits 26% and misses 74% of the time, and a 72% cold calling range, which means he's calling a ton of crap. They hit top pair or better, open and straight draw, or pair plus a gut shot 24% of the time, and they miss 76% of the time. So you can see that the wider their pre-flop range, the less likely they'll hit something on the flop worth sticking around for, and the more likely they'll fold to your bets. Your half-pot bet only needs to work 33% of the time, and if they're whiffing 76% of the time, then you're printing money with each of these situations you're putting yourself in. So the next question, you got to ask is, what does it mean if they stick around and call you down? Well, you'll have to refer to your stats and notes to help you with this. But either they're super sticky with marginal pairs and draws, or they've got something worth calling and your bluffs might not work. This is where hand history reviews and studying these situations over and over again will help your barreling game. And speaking of hand history reviews, step number 4 in analyzing barreling is filtering for hands in Poker Tracker 4. So choose your date range, maybe last night's, maybe the whole prior week's play, whatever it is. Under hand details, choose player position, then flop and is in position. So choose player is hero as well. Under actions and opportunities, choose pre-flop and pre-flop raises and any raise. So this is looking at situations where you're in position and you raised pre-flop. Now it's time to review these hands, taking into consideration all we've discussed, from the bet sizing you make, to your opponent's stats and notes, to their ranges and how well they flop. Are you making good c-bets and double barrels? Are you getting them to fold? Are your bet sizes big enough? Are you giving up too soon and not firing that second barrel? Are you paying attention to your opponent's stats before you make your flop, turn, or river plays? Are you playing fit or fold poker and just firing with strong flopped hands? These are all questions you need to ask yourself as you review your hands. Wow, that was a lot to unpack there for analyzing barreling situations. After we do all that, we're ready to really work on our barreling game. Step 5 in our 7 steps is to take action, which is the most important part in this entire process. We're trying to work on our barreling game and choosing good spots to try to get opponents to fold. This will be your focus in the next few sessions you play. If you're starting off with good hand selections and playing most pots in position and being aggressive pre-flop, you'll have plenty of chances to practice your barreling. Be judicious in your choices, and don't barrel if it seems your opponent won't fold. Even if he isn't strong, but he's a calling station and will call you down with bottom pair, make sure you have a hand that can beat what he's likely calling you down with. If you have a complete bluff, ace high, king high, or queen high, don't fire blindly. Have a reason for every bet you make with a reasonable expectation that he'll fold. If he ain't folding and you can't beat jack squat, don't bet. Save the chips and put them to better use later in profitable spots. And at the end of your session, answer the following questions. How do I feel about the session played? How did I like employing the skills I learned? And do I think this skill has some value? And does it merit further review before fully integrating it into my repertoire? So after you've taken action, of course, step 6 is assessment. The next day, you'll do an assessment of your session. This is a hand history review following the steps we outlined earlier, and you want to review all of your c-betting and barreling opportunities. Ask yourself these questions again. Am I making good c-bets and double barrels? Am I getting them to fold? Are my bet sizes big enough? Am I giving up too soon and not firing that second barrel? Am I paying attention to my opponent's stats before I make my flop, turn, or river plays? Am I playing fit or fold poker and just firing with strong flopped hands and checking behind everything else? So take notes on what worked and what didn't, what you learned, or questions you may have, and things to follow up on for more study. Make changes to your summary based on any relevant information. Post difficult spots in forums or ask your poker buddies about them. And step 7, like always, is rinse, repeat, review. Now that you've made the initial assessment, it's time to take action again in another session and try to barrel your weak opponents off of their hands. Use this new skill and make any adjustments you want to make, then assess again afterwards. We're just repeating steps 5 through 7 until we decide to fully commit to this new skill of barreling. Challenge! Here's my challenge to you for this episode. Purposely play your next 3 sessions with the sole intent of getting into as many hands as possible with weak opponents while in position and as the pre-flop raiser, and try to extract value, like we discussed last episode, or try to push them off their hands in good barreling spots. This is actually MED, or minimum effective dose number 10, that we talked about back in episode 24, so these are valuable skills to put into your arsenal. Work on them now and ingrain them in your unconscious competence, as they'll help you move up the levels. Now it's your turn to take action and do something positive for your poker game.
Oh, that's it now. Get out there and be somebody. Go write a book.
Okay, to recap, we discussed how profitable it can be to barrel against players with wide, weak ranges. We learned the math behind barreling and how often bets have to work to be profitable. We learned what opponent types to look for to barrel off of hands and what stats to really consider to aid in our barreling choices. We also analyzed how different ranges hit flops well enough to stay in beyond the flop. And we ended with a great challenge designed to add barreling into your unconscious competence. Please go to the show notes at smartpokerstudy.com/pod28 for everything mentioned here. And while you're there, make sure you download the 7 Steps to Poker Learning PDF. Thank you so much for listening today. Send me your constructive feedback through the show notes page. You can also send an email to sky@smartpokerstudy.com, tweet me at smartpokerstudy, or post in the Facebook group at smartpokerstudy.com/discuss. And I need your questions for the Friday episodes. Keep them coming. Alrighty, poker people, be sure to come back for tomorrow's episode number 29, where I continue in Ed Miller's book, The Course for Skill Number 5, Evaluating Board Texture. And wow, this is vital stuff for show. Word of mouth is the best advertising, and a recommendation from you to your friends would be most appreciated. If you enjoyed our time together and learned a little something, please share it with your classmates. Until next time, study smart, play much, and make your next session the best one yet.